Hey guys, what is up? Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome to the channel. If you're back again, thank you so much for coming back again. I'm really excited. Next week I'm about to start a new series. I was going to start it this week and I'm really excited about this new series, so make sure you tune in. It's going to be real fun. But instead I was on social media and I saw this question of why does God have favourites, and just something in me was like, you need to speak about this idea. Why does God have favourites? It's easy to think God has favourites, but I just want to quickly at the very start of this video tell you God does not have favourites. He loves every single person just as much as he loves every single person. He loves you all the same. He loves us all the same. And if you're watching this today thinking God has favourites, unfortunately you're wrong. God doesn't have favourites, and I know he doesn't have favourites because the Bible gives us examples of how of people who could be God's favourites and people who would not be God's favourites. And we get to see their lives and what God does in their lives, which I'm going to be talking about today. Two examples of how God, how someone who could be God's favourite, his life turns out, and someone who isn't God's favourite, who would never be on the list of God's favourite if God did have a list, and how his life turns out. So join with me as we do that. But really quickly, I want to just talk into this question, this idea that we compare ourselves with people, and that's how we judge God's favour. God's favour shouldn't be like that. We shouldn't be comparing ourselves with others. In fact, when we compare ourselves with others, we steal the joy of what God is doing in our processes. And just because you're going through a difficult process doesn't mean that God's not favouring you. We've spoken about this before, about this idea of this journey that we go on with God, when God favours us and shows us prosperity in the hardest of times. But it's so easy when we look down the road and we see someone with 2.5 kids and we see them with this fantastic house, or we see them with this great family, and we're coming from a broken house, a broken family. We've got no job, we've got this, that and the other wrong, and we start comparing ourselves, and it's so easy to say, God, why is it so difficult? Why can't I be a favourite? It's maybe even spiritually, if you're a Christian, you're watching this and you're looking at people who read their Bible regularly or on worship team, and they're great at this, that and the other. They've got this position or that position and leading in this role, and you're like, God, I don't get it. Why do you have favourites, and why am I not one of them? Well, we start in the Old Testament with this guy called Job, found in the book of Job, and in the first chapter is where we're just really going to stay for the moment, and it's the fact that Job is this guy who absolutely is in awe of God, and he chases God with everything. In fact, he makes sacrifices for his children to say to God sorry if they've sinned, because he wants to make sure that they are living a righteous life, and he is seen as righteous before God. And actually what happens in the story is Satan comes in to meet God and God says, well, where have you come from? And Satan says, well, I've been roaming the earth back and forth. And God says, well, have you seen my servant Job? He's upright. He's doing well. If God had a list of favourites, Job would rewrite up there. He could be the favourite. If God had this list, he would be the one. And Satan turns to him and goes, yeah, well, it's easy for Job because of his life. Look at his life. It's great. And God turns to Satan and says, hey, here's the deal we'll make. You can strip every single thing away from Job. And you can take it all away. Don't touch Job. And we'll really see if he still honours me. Job literally loses everything. His friends, his family all die. He loses his livelihood, his house, everything is gone from Job. His wealth and what would be seen as prosperity is completely disappeared. It's just not there anymore. And yet we look at Job as this guy who surely would be God's favourite. Now, at the end of the story, a bit of a spoiler alert coming along here, but at the end of the story, God restores, because God is the God of restoration, but God also restores even greater what was than what was there originally, because that's who he is. Now we're going to compare that really quick to a guy in the New Testament, a guy called Saul. Saul goes around whole of Israel and just completely tries to stamp out Christianity. He goes around and tries to stop it from spreading, stop it from growing. Saul's mission is to stop Christianity, and he's literally anti-God. He's not just like an atheist, I don't believe in God. He's like, I'm actively going to stop Christianity because it is horrible. And he has this anger and passion inside him to stop Christianity. If Saul would be on this list of God's favourites, he'd be right at the bottom. Thankfully, that list isn't real. Because if God had a list of favourites, there was no way Saul would be ever used by God, would ever have a mission for God. And so what happens in this life, we find that Saul goes on this journey to Damascus, and God turns up to Saul and says, Saul, stop persecuting my church, and instead come and you follow me. And Saul becomes Paul. Paul becomes one of the greatest evangelists of all time. We read this in the Bible, this missionary, this guy who goes out with a fire. Yes, I once persecuted you, but now I'm helping the churches grow. Now I'm instructing the churches. Now I'm telling them and teaching them of what they should do. He writes some of the most incredible books of the Bible that we now hold. This guy who would be at the bottom of God's favourite list. Why? Because God doesn't have favourites. God uses every single person he can. And no matter whether we are honouring God or we're so far away from God, God is calling you today to be a part of his story. And life might be really difficult, and God knows that. And God never says to us, hey, your life is going to be absolutely brilliant and you're going to have loads of money and it's going to be just fantastic. That doesn't happen, and we read that in the Bible, that in the most difficult times of our life, God prospers us. But God is inviting you to be part of this story and journey. God created every single person unique. We're all different. We all have different views and different thoughts. And what God might be saying to you today, what I believe God is saying to you today, is it's not about having favourites, being the best or being the worst. What it's about is sticking through the process, even when it gets difficult. Even when it's hard, and even when you look around you and everybody else seems to be having this absolutely fantastic time, God's saying to you today, even throughout that all, would you stick with me through the process? Will you stick with me through the journey? In the hard times, in the best times, in the doubts and on the mountaintops. Will you stick with me and follow me? Because this process will make you better, and it will make you stronger as you follow me more. That's it. That's the story. That's all I've got to share with you today is no matter how good we might feel, no matter how bad you may feel, God doesn't have favourites. It's clearly biblical examples of Job and Saul, who becomes Paul. And so let's get rid of that myth. But let's also stick with God through the hardest times, trust in the process, and when it does feel like God's got favourites and we're not one of them, let's remember that God is doing something in our lives specifically that is greater than we could ever imagine. Now unto him who is able to do immeasurably more than we could ask, think of, or imagine. Be blessed. Be blessed.